Hello there, everyone. Let's hope that all microphones are working. So I didn't check that before, but the little flickering lights are flickering for me, so it looks like everything's okay. Hi, Robin. How you going?
Hi, very well yourself.
I'm doing all right. It's good to be back in the seat with Dungeon Mastery Episode 3.
Number three.
Oh, I might have a bit of a delay on your audio potentially.
Let's try it again. Just speaking, see if that's any better.
It is
Is there any
all
way for you
right.
to test that?
If someone if anyone's in chat can verify that, but otherwise, it is all good. Cool, man. How you been? What's new?
Been very well. We ran the one shot last time that I was on stream, which was a culmination of a few different techniques and trying out a few different new things as a DM. So from a D&D side of things, it's been good. A lot of reflection and looking forward to planning the next adventure. What about yourself?
Been prepping and trying to get things moving forward in my Robin the Frostmaiden campaign with the Raging Rolls. Got that to a head last week, which might come up in our conversations today. And
Looking
I'm
forward to
excited
that
now
one.
to see where they go next. Now there's kind of like they've got a few threads they can try and dig into. I'm really excited about where they're going to go. Progress the story a little bit. It's one of those things where I know we're in this written module where it should be going, and you're kind of like stuck in this area for a little bit, and like, how long is this going to take before you move on? Are they going to get bored? But anyway, we've spoken about DM anxiety in previous episodes.
We definitely have. Although I do think this is always going to be one of those topics that are an undercurrent of everything, right?
Absolutely.
Every new thing we try will come with a bit of that anxiety and wondering, are we going too fast, too slow? Are they enjoying themselves? Should we be moving them along because there's more fun to be had?
Yeah.
But
So tonight we're going to dig into villain creation, monster creation, but favorite monsters, the monsters of the world, how to develop, how we go about developing villains, monsters, and so on. This was a topic you suggested, Robin. Tell me, I'm going to just throw you one off the cuff here that I don't think you were
please.
expecting. Why is this particular topic something you thought would be really cool to dig into?
I think monsters and the villains that make up the game are some of the most interesting things to discover as a player and to sort of understand about the world that you've stepped into. Most villains don't walk around, like at least in real life, waving flags saying I'm the bad guy and kill me to stop the bad things from happening. I think learning from like real life, a lot of the time some of those big impacts from stories that we witness and media that we consume are those villains that we don't necessarily see coming, that betray us as the audience and cause us to feel some of that same anguish that the characters themselves would be feeling. I guess watching more horror films over the last probably year of my life than I ever have before, I've been able to have really visceral reactions to monsters and villains portrayed on the big screen, and ways that made me feel like that's a villain. That's somebody that is despicable. Like there's evil in that person as they're being portrayed on the screen. I guess from a D&D perspective, I want to be able to, as best as I can, bring some of that magic, that like hatred for the opponent that you're facing. You're vindicated by your crusade to destroy them because they are just so evil and undisputedly so, you know?
Right, yeah, I can hear you're very much in camp evil and horror, and this guy, whatever, or girl, whoever this creature is, this big bad that needs to be taken down, just epitomizes and oozes badness, right?
I think there's flavors, but like if you're going to make a bad guy that's supposed to be hated, make sure that your players don't like them,
Absolutely.
or at least
I,
not at the end of the campaign at the very least.
I agree. I'm gonna throw a spanner at you again. In the most recent episode of Robin the Frostmaiden we ran, what I was trying to do with my particular villain there was like make everything he's doing seem reasonable to him, and that if he could explain himself good enough to the characters, or well enough to the characters, maybe there was oh shit, is this the right course of action to be taking out this guy? How do you think about like fully evil, I'm a demon trying to destroy the world, versus someone who's got motives which he can justify in a reasonable way?
I think also, when we have those kind of, I don't know, there are definitely characters and players that are more tempted by the gray areas of morality. And I think good villains can play off of those gray areas and potentially undermine the party in the most insidious way of all, which is in ideals and ideologies, and actually convincing players to shift the way they think about things, and obviously not in their best interest. I think of one example of when even the world itself can be very dangerous and filled with these choices where do I touch the glowing black chalice, for example? That's kind of evil painted, but maybe it's good. Maybe it's to be trusted. Maybe if we just this time, it won't kill us all. I think D&D also allows us to mess with things we wouldn't in real life and see what happens, and kind of lean a bit into the chaos. And okay, maybe the city was destroyed, but we got to fight a god, and that was pretty epic.
We've all been there, that's true. Yeah, I do like those moments where you're presented with an opportunity as a player to interact with something you know as a player it's going to cause chaos and like affects whatever the big bad is going to do at the end, but your character just has to do it. It's just one of those things. That's how my character plays. I'm sorry.
And that's exactly it. And I think you lead on really nicely to one of our first sort of questions of the day, but we wanted to talk a little bit about how you plan your monsters into your world and into your sessions. How do you go about, let's talk about it at a session level first, but you've got a session a week's time, which monsters are going in there? How do you get your inspiration for which to throw at your players?
I am very driven, I guess inspired by trying to make sure the monsters that are in the sessions I plan fit the setting. I can't grab some random monster, just flick the page open at random and say, this guy. I can't do it. I know some people can do it and say, random encounter, here's a thing in this random environment. No, I'm trying to make sure that if there's going to be a potential for, say, an encounter on the snowy plains, then I'm looking for Arctic creatures. However, there is another thing I really want to keep in mind here, is that I really want to make sure that any monster or encounter I throw at my players has a reason to be there. Because as much as I really want to just throw random encounters at them, I tried this earlier on. I threw some ice methods at these characters. So they're pretty low level. They fit the scenario, they fit the world, the setting. Throw some ice methods at them. And that in my brain was just going to be, you guys haven't fought anything yet. Quick, you got to just test out your combat.
Edge of battle.
But straight after, there was just all these inquiries like, oh, where did these creatures come from? Are they supposed to be there? Were they summoned by some other deity? I'm like, no, just because you needed to fight something. So with that in the background, I try to make sure that as much as possible, scenarios which are encounters that are planned out, are planned with some kind of threat or reason that they're there.
At least from the monster's perspective, right? Like those ice methods might just have been trying to scrounge for food because it was an ice plane, and that's enough of a reason for them to have been there. But it needs to have more than just, monsters appear.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if it is the monster, like if you're walking into the monster's territory, then be ready to fight something that fits that territory, right? And that's the reason it exists.
And I think that's like a cool part of monster design as we dive into it, is that you're going to the monster's home. They're not coming to yours. They've got the home field advantage in their ecosystem. They're bred for the cold. They're bred for whatever mountain you find them in, or whatever cave they're sort of slithering through. So a question for you, as sort of we go through to that next piece, how do you allow your monsters to make use of that home field advantage?
This is something I'm still trying to grapple with myself. Um, I more and more, and learning from yourself, Robin, I want to make sure that whatever creatures are there, I'm not just going to say, what's my action? What options have I got? Do that. I'm trying to make sure, okay, what is it, the environment around each creature and how can they use that to their advantage? Equally, are they screwed and should they just get the hell out of there? But trying to use the environment, their setting, and the encounter, I guess, scenario they've been placed in to their advantage, it's something I'm still trying to wrangle with myself. How have you managed to achieve something like that?
And it's as equal a struggle for me to do this right. I think it's easier for big boss fights, right? Because you can
100%.
build their environment into their actions. I think that's a really good trick. If you do want to include that, make sure that it's something that you know ahead of time. These are sort of the big actions they can take. An example I saw is definitely, again, Matt Koval, the same sort of GM guy I shared last time, a few of the different sessions, but he talks about, action-based monsters, and it's like they are able to act outside of the traditional character turns, because otherwise it's just unfair. You can't have an epic boss fight with one monster if six AI, like six NPCs, are just smacking it every time it gets to do one hit. It's just eventually going to go down regardless of what you try and do to it. So giving the monster a few of those unique trump cards for its environment, I think, is some of the magic source to a monster feeling really epic. Is that it's like, if you're in a spider tomb and it can bring down the ceiling on top of you, suddenly you're like, oh, I'm playing in a league outside of anything else I've dealt with up until this point.
And when you say things like that, are you referring to just things like lair actions and legendary actions in that regard, or are you thinking like, let's get more creative than what's written in the text?
I think we can be a lot more creative as DMs than rules as written really allow us to be. I think we have the ability to create monsters that are a little bit unfair, right? But that's okay. The world is unfair, and the players are doing everything in their power to make their character as overtuned as possible within the bounds of the rules. So it's like, every once in a while, I'm allowed to have the power in my favor.
Absolutely.
And so I think of things like poison daggers, and I think of things like being able to throw sand as like a reaction to make a free escape. Things like that make even low-level thieves formidable, because they have unique things that make them dangerous because of their experience, right?
Interesting, because I was going to say, like, it feels like we're talking very much around high-level boss fights, which is kind of the theme what we're talking about here. My characters or my players are not up to high-level boss fights yet, but they're trying, like, there's a few low-level things. So when you're saying things like even Thief in the Night trying to throw sand and get the hell out of there, is that something that you would still say could be done just at any point in time during that encounter? Just, I throw sand and I run. Well, the character throws sand and run.
My DMing style definitely leans itself very much to that camp. Like, I consider, every time I put on the hat of a monster, I think to myself, like, this is an intelligent being that has mine or above my intelligence or below my intelligence, but like, they still have a survival instinct. They still have a drive to win. How would I approach this if I were them? I would be being resourceful. I wouldn't just like go down without a fight. I'm scrappy. If I've lived in the streets my whole life, I'm not gonna not have any tricks. It's like, as I'm being backed in a corner by the players, I often think to myself, okay, what if I was a thief in the city? Oh, great. Boom. Like, if I can think about it, they could have, right? Like, that's the reasoning I have to pass in my own head to put it into the game.
It feels like there's lot of quick thinking involved in that kind of thing. And I say that for two reasons. One is the first, as a DM and trying to manage, say, multiple monsters in a fight, you're looking at 3, 4, 5, there's many different like stat blocks all at once.
Yeah.
Trying to process them all and figure out this guy does this and then they're going to do that and this guy's going to do this thing based on what their actions and things are available. And then to put yourself, or probably ahead of time, inside the shoes of that character or that monster to take that action that's outside of like the box, if a stat block is a box, kind of approach. And then to then think about, and this is, I really can get your thoughts on this, to say, well, okay, this makes sense for this character to grab a handful of dirt and chuck it at nearest person's face. Is that a dex save? Is there damage taken? Like, what does that mean? If it's not on a stat block, you've got to make it up, and that's hard.
It is. And like, the only consolation I will give you is that players will offer endless options to you when they feel like they're being screwed over, right? It's like they will try anything. And like, I also think that's fine, because like, I think there's something fun about the scrappiness of like, you are watching him about to grab some sand. It's like, I want to try and knock the sand out of his hand. You're like, hang on, that wasn't where my story was going, but I'll let you make the sleight of hand check. You know, do you want to do the dexterity save against him? Do you want to do opposed? And like, then we're building a story together now. Like my idea, my like sort of, he reaches down to grab some sand on the ground, either is going to be met with, I intervened, or it goes off and they're in trouble. But at least in that moment, it's like that monster is now alive. It's doing something that's unexpected.
And the unexpected is always going to be met with the unexpected in return.
Yes. I'm curious on your side, right? Like, I appreciate that I can do that ad hoc thing, but when it comes to trying to create meaningful encounters week to week as you do sort of these regular sessions, how are you looking at those 5 stat blocks and thinking narratively, how am I going to make sure that these fights feel unique each time and feel like we're having these fights for different reasons?
That is a hard question, and I think to your point earlier, I try not to connect myself to that stat block. In fact, there's a lot of times, so I'd say 80% of the time, an encounter happens and I'd never even looked at the stat block for the creatures that are going to be in that fight, right? Because half the time you don't know whether that fight's going to happen or not. And I think I've just gone off on a tangent on your question, but I'm going to ramble anyway.
Go. It's our podcast, I guess.
No, I'm not, because now I'm drawing a blank.
Oh, brilliant. We've made a big moment.
Crushing it. You're saying, how do you pull yourself out of those different stat blocks to actually make?
Yeah, how do you plan for spontaneity? How do you make sure that you do have a few of those cool little tricks up your sleeve to pull out when the moment is right in your games?
I've recently been evolving or iterating on this kind of process in my planning. Whereas previously I've been planning in a fairly linear fashion, or even in like a forked tree type fashion, I'm now just thinking, and that was fine, but often it was fine to plan like that because that's the way my brain would connect different steps together. But that's not the way players connect those steps together. And when they jump from point A to point, J in one step, all those middle points that I had planned no longer make any sense. And so getting to point J straight away, there's no context there. So now I'm starting to think about things in terms of a number of scenarios with flexibility that can run at any time and pretty much in any location.
Can you give us an example of one that's maybe already been experienced that you were able to bring out, or even if you want to hide and obfuscate some of the details?
Yeah, sure. So in the episode before last in Ramen the Frostmate, I think it was 13, I had an idea in mind that the players were going to try and sneak out of this tavern, track down get their way through the town, track down where the head villain of the town was staying, and try and assassinate him. But in that period, in wandering through the town, they were going to have town guard follow them, and there would be an encounter with the town guard. That wasn't how things played out at all. In fact, they never even left the tavern. They instead, because I knew that my encounter in mind was, there's all these town guard trying to find them. They're going to have to encounter them somewhere, somehow. So I had my town guard sort of fight plan. But they took that in a different direction and sort of buried themselves in the tavern. And through a couple of ability checks I'd sort of pre-planned out as people were getting from point A to point B, that was going to determine the number of city guard that knew where they were. And that could have been wherever they ended up. Basically how many eyes saw them. And that allowed me the flexibility to say this encounter happens here or here, but it's the same kind of encounter.
And you knew, depending on those checks, how difficult it would be regardless of where it showed up.
Exactly right. And that's something that I was pretty happy with, getting to that point in my planning structure to say, here's some dependencies, but they're not directly connected to each other.
I like that. That's very cool.
I hope go forward with it.
How do you find tracking those different milestones? Like if they did do this and they didn't do that, and do you have like a number? It's like, oh well, that one made that there will be less guards, so like the number went from 7 to 6. like how did you track that?
Oh, how did I track it? I had 4 bullet points and said there was 4 groups of guards with different combinations of each type of guard in them, and that let me have up to 4 ability checks before they got where they were going to get B. Now they only managed to pass 1 because I never they only managed to have 1 ability check because I never really left the building, which means only that 1 group of guards knew where they were.
Right.
But if I had left the tavern and gone out into the town, there was going to be 4 different, more or less, stealth checks, which could have ended up with a 14 on 6 fight.
So because they didn't explore, they didn't get exposed to all your little traps.
Yeah, but they found chaos a completely another way.
Yeah, luckily that's always going to be the truth, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's very cool. I think that's I think more of that is what I'd love to be able to do a little bit more of. Is like the world is going to respond to you in a predictable way, and it's like that's part of the DM fun is I know the system I've built, and now you guys are going to go through my system. It's like I've built a roller coaster. Now let's see how you guys handle it. It's some of that game design testing, isn't it?
Absolutely. But tell me, how would you plan for something like, scenarios happening in any type of event? Because we've thrown some definite curveballs at you before, and you've adapted pretty well. Are those kind of things you've thought about in advance, those kind of encounters, or just going, oh shit, now what?
I think like a game like D&D allows you to take very little and create a lot with it, which I've used to my success, I guess. It's like if I'm thrown into a situation, one example I can think of is you guys were in Waterdeep and you had annoyed the city guard for one of many reasons up until that point. And it was bad. I think that's when Xanathar did his whole thing, and there was like a light show in the city sky attracting pretty much every guard from the surrounding area to come to this point in the city, and left sitting there was just destruction and your group around the corpse of a mind flayer at the time. And that was something that already had thrown me for a loop, but then I had to kind of think, okay, now I am the city responding to this event. How would the city respond? How would a magic city with walking statues for guards react to a magic light show in the middle of the city? It's like, do we escalate to the top level threat? No, probably not. The light has stopped. It's like, but we are sending people to check it out. Who's our quickest responders? Well, the flying knights on their griffins, which I remember reading about, would obviously still be around. So quickly, middle of the session, great, I've got like a first point of contact. And so my mission is to just get that in front of you guys. And so that becomes like a really easy first step. I move them to you, and then that's then when you guys start to determine, in my mind, how the rest of that scenario unfolds. If you approach with civility and with reverence, the world is going to respond and mirror some of that reverence. But if you respond antagonistically, there's no chance that they're going to come with, nothing but antagonizing you in response. So luckily, you guys like clockwork antagonize almost any NPC that I throw in front of you. So the world is flexible, but the results seem consistent as we keep having these moments. And that's interesting because we now have an altercation, but they're not really very excited to actually arrest you. Like, they are aware that there is like more to the story, but right now you guys are being a hostile threat to their city, and they've got to just contain you so that they can restore order and move on with the rest of the city's operations. So that I know almost immediately from their point of view, and then I just see how you guys react, and I kind of judge each point based on that, like what we talked about before. Why are they there? What's their reason to be there? If I can figure that out, I can navigate the rest very, very easily just through adapting on the fly.
So that's your like you said, adapting on the fly. Something happens, I'm gonna send in whatever makes sense for that city to do at the time. Let's imagine that turned into another full-on combat encounter. How would you go about, two-part question, how would you go about properly balancing like a pre-planned combat encounter versus something just happens on the fly? Because balancing encounters is something just, sorry, context. Balancing encounters is something I've been really struggling with historically. I've fallen in the trap of saying, hey, this should be the villain. Villain's usually on his own, or going to be on his own, and then he just gets completely slaughtered. And every time I put an encounter or a pre-planned combat encounter in front of players, they usually just walk all over it. So what's the secret? Besides creating massive, out of the blue creatures that appear.
Yeah. I think like I mix this with a combination, especially with boss monsters. Boss monsters have to be tough, right? They have to. There's a reason that they've survived in this world longer than their like peers. They've survived long enough to become epic. So it's okay for them to be stronger. And as you just mentioned, your players, if well rested, and then put in front of something powerful, just because they're also powerful, there's more of them, it can sometimes not be even a fair fight then. Like, the problem with D&D is, even if you're like a powerful caster, for example, a mage can only wipe out, one of them at a time unless they're positioned badly and a lightning strike has hit the entire party in a line. So I'm a bit of a fan of the, I don't know if you like the 3 health bar boss fights, where it's like you kill the first health bar, and then we're in phase 2 of the fight. It's like you've gotten through that phase. What made that phase iconic is probably over, but now we're in the same theme, but like the stakes have changed. An example of this that I tried recently was when we were in the Feywild, and we were sort of on our way back towards sort of Trankasha, where we had this fight that was happening. We knew kind of the direction it was going. We had to fight the hags. We were going into the fight. We started sort of that battle, but then like as we finished that, we escalated and we kind of got to the bigger phase 2, which was actually the fight that was happening.
You're a psycho! Oh my god. I keep telling her she's a terrorist, and she is. Wait,
Oh, that was brilliant.
look at... There's just shit everywhere.
Nothing a quick vacuum won't solve.
Oh my god.
Not sure what was happening there.
You know who the real villain of the story is? God.
Is it still you?
It's not me. It's not me. Okay, there's a few years. All right.
It's fine. I can see the grey hairs now just sprouting up.
I'm gonna lock on this door.
One of these days.
Oh my god. Okay, sorry. What were we saying?
No, you're good. Yeah, the phases, right? So I think it's kind of fun when bosses change as the fight progresses. I think you reward players by showing that, you know, they're obviously making progress, but that, you know, it's not just going to be a cakewalk. And it should get almost more deadly the closer the boss is to death, because they're going to also be more desperate and more willing to do potentially deadly things in order to survive.
How do you actually approach that though? Like, what are doing more deadly things? What is level 1, level 2? What are the 3 different phases look like when you've only got one stat block to work with?
Why do you only have one stat block to work with?
Well, rules is just playing, just, you know.
For sure. Rules is written is one thing.
Yeah, but you're just being like a entry DM, such as myself.
Yes.
Pull monster out of random book. Okay, what's this guy? I don't know. Dybbuk. No one knows what that is.
Show me the picture if you want to just show it to the screen.
This guy right here. Probably not considered a boss, but he is.
And what typings? What typings do we have there?
He is a medium fiend.
Throw me an environment.
Whoa.
Any.
Coastal town.
Awesome. So I'm seeing undead, I'm seeing coastal, I'm thinking pirates initially. Like, I'm talking skeletal pirate crew, and we're seeing like the remnants of them rise. It's something is bringing them back to life. And so we've got the crew, which is probably a bunch of those guys, but who's leading this group? Who's the instigator? And now we've got the boss. So we draw from whatever that like bad guy does, but then we think
there's a boss.
There's a boss, right? Now we've found a boss in the book, and we can draw from the two, right? We can use them both as inspiration for what we're going to build. And this is obviously very off the cuff, but what's one of the unique abilities for that demon?
The second one, this guy?
Yeah.
Unique abilities, let's see. He has a many-tailed whip. You're talking about his actions, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, like, that's already something that this pirate captain could have picked up along his way, right? Like, big pirate captain, bulky, he's huge, sort of cat of nine tails.
Yep.
And it's just been made thematically, you know, connected, but it's obviously from a very different stat block.
Right.
And so now we've got, you know, potentially phase 1. He's like even that basic mob, right? Like, it's very easy to kill, but once he dies, he's reanimated, and the demonic item that has, you know, that he has that's brought all these things to life, it cracks and releases some of that demonic energy. And now he's bigger, he's bulkier, he's in phase 2. He's got the stat block from the second creature, but we've been able to create 2 phases because he's had, you know, borrowed from the first stat block and then transitioned to the second stat block through combat.
Where's this second stat block come from?
The monster, the second monster you flick to.
I see what you're saying. So you take the first one, and then he gets killed, comes back as, you know, gets back up as a second creature. Gotcha. So you can basically combine multiple stat blocks that are thematically connected somehow, like you said, into one mega creature with phases.
We get to make up the thematics, right? Like, that's the power of DMs, is that any monster works for any setting as long as we're willing to just rewrite some of the flavor.
Gotcha. What about... Okay, yes, I agree. I love it, and I'm absolutely going to use that at some point in Realm of the Frost Maiden, so look out, Rages. So that's kind of thinking about a big boss fight at the end. How do you balance just a regular encounter?
I think there's lots of ways that I've read and tried to balance encounters. I think the only thing that's ever really worked for me is making sure that I, as the DM, have flexibility to increase or decrease the difficulty of the encounter ad hoc as it's necessary. It's like the players are strong, and a game of D&D is not fun if your players aren't being challenged.
Yep.
But I also think there's like a really tough balance, because you mentioned it perfectly before. Your players should also feel like they can explore a world and sometimes be too strong for a place that they find themselves in. That's also appropriate sometimes. But trying to strike that balance is obviously quite difficult.
I agree. I'm more recently picking up the variable number of creatures and upping or lowering things as well, not lowering, but more so upping things as I see.
Always
But I come back to not something you've said on this show podcast, but something you've told me previously when I was planning a different one shot, is that these kind of encounters are best kind of run in a predefined, well, a limited number of rounds. I've run encounters before where it's, I've got my 7 guys. Oh shit, it's taking like 8 rounds to get through this 40-second combat, and that's going to take me 4 hours to get through, and it becomes laborious. All right, so I guess my question here is, we're balancing encounters by using the levers on number of fodder, which go into it more or less. What about balancing encounters for enjoyment?
I think I'm like of the enjoyment camp almost entirely. I think combat in D&D shouldn't exist if it's not fun, and I personally don't find tedious monster crawling fun. And I know that some people play this entire game for that element of it, right? So it's very much a personal preference thing. But for me, I think of D&D more from a narrative lens, and for me that means that combat should be intense, it should be engaging, there should be stakes, but it shouldn't drag on. It's like, I don't know if you've ever watched some of those like kung fu movies, and after like 15 minutes of the two of them like like just like hitting each other, you're like, all right, come on, you guys have thrown each other into multiple buildings at this point, and like onto cars, driven over by buses. Like, one of you is going to win, and at this point I'm not even sure if one of you can go down. I don't want it to be like a wet noodle fight either, and I think it's more satisfying when both sides have really impactful hits that very quickly can like sway the battle back and forth. I think like narratively that's fun, especially when you can bounce off each other and be like, wow, he just took his arm off. Well, now I'm going to go for the other arm. Like in that moment of intensity, like you find like wins build off each other. So I think something I try and do as a matter of principle is I try and kill the weakest character, the weakest player, the person that's vulnerable, the one that's pissed me off the most as that character, as that bad guy, as like a focus. Like, I think if I'm an intelligent monster, I'm trying to increase my odds of winning, and the best way to do that is to reduce the number of enemies I'm going up against. I think too often as DMs, we try and like split the damage, or at least I do. I'm like, oh, you've been hit by a big one. Now it's time for somebody else to get the brunt of that. But the game gets way more fun when like your friend that you spent the last 6 months playing with suddenly has their character on the line. And now it doesn't matter if that boss fight's easy. I'm going to have to play it carefully anyways, because they could die permanently if I slip up. I think like that's a different conversation than if you can get that right first.
Were you saying then, as a DM, you've got to play it carefully, or as a player, I need to?
As a player, you're put on your like back foot immediately. Like, I can chase you down and try and kill you, but then I might be leaving my friend to die from the death saves.
This is true. I love a good death save.
And like, if you're an enemy and these people have literally run you around for several months at a time, you will not show mercy when you've downed them. You're not going to wait to take them out. They're just never going to be a threat to you ever again. Especially like depending on the type of villain. If it's like an orc leader, sure, crush skull. If it's like a villain trying to use them for political gains, that's a different story. But I think like make sure that there's always a real threat, because if there's not a real threat, the combat falls apart very quickly in D&D.
Do you think that every like encounter with as like a boss level requires combat?
Personally, I think D&D would be a worse game if that were true.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think sometimes even in life, the most difficult encounters we navigate rarely involve us getting into a fist fight, but can often mean the difference between like very different and completely like unique futures. You know, like you're navigating a conversation with somebody that's thinking about pressing the nuke button. That encounter relies on whether or not you can convince them to, you know, to appeal to their humanity, for lack of a better word. You know, killing them will never win. Like before you even get to them, they'll press the button. That for me is a fulfilling conclusion and a really unique way to do a combat encounter without any sort of violence.
So that includes, that's, you're talking about RP and trying to be like, you know, talk someone off the edge, so to speak. How do you bring other kind of scenarios to life in a boss encounter, like, for example, a puzzle or a trap, other things like that?
I think like because of the multiple health bar thing, if you think about like every boss fight as 3 distinct phases, or you can obviously vary this depending on the fight, but like the first phase might be that they're like fighting you, they're approaching you very directly, they're testing your mettle, but as they see you're beating them, they make their retreat, and suddenly you're left to try and follow them through a maze, right? Like they know the maze because it's their home, right? They've set up these traps. They know exactly what to avoid. They scurry through it like it's nothing. But you and your party, oh, you guys have no idea what you're stepping into. So like you've used that encounter as the second phase, and when you get to the other side and finally get to face them, they'll be different. They'll have time to prepare. They'll be anticipating your arrival and know how strong you are. And that's suddenly, again, like a very different fight to the first fight that you had before the maze.
I love that. Are you pulling these different ideas out of inspiration from somewhere, or just out of your butt?
I mean, like, it's probably inspired by everything. Like, I love fantasy and I love adventures, and I grew up reading like young adult fantasy, but also young adult adventure novels and mystery novels, and growing up in like pop culture around like Scooby-Doo and every villain of the month that was never actually evil, like a villain, like a monstrous entity, but rather always somebody with like another motivation. I think I was hardwired to think of this stuff.
Yeah, fair enough. I find at the moment now, I watch a lot of Disney, right? I'm not gonna lie, and that's purely because kids over the last few years. But my God, some of those Disney villains can be brought to life in all sorts of different ways.
I don't know if you must have watched Frozen in recent years.
Just a couple of hundred times.
A couple. Like how good is a villain like the villain that ends up being sort of the love interest and towards the end of the movie, and you kind of like feel this build up of this character through the whole thing, only to realize in that instant like that you've been misled. And it's like I feel like those kind of moments are what I aspire to as a DM to create.
Yeah. That's interesting. Actually, one of the things I've been reading more about and hearing more about is, you know, introduce the villain to your players early, and then have them get the hell out of there and come back later. Yeah. I'm yet to really bring that to life. I think in the Rime of the Frost Maiden one, that has happened already to some degree, but there are a lot of bosses in this campaign.
Nice.
And I haven't found an opportunity yet to introduce, say, a more senior boss at this early in the campaign, but I think it's really valuable. Have you been able to do something like that in the campaigns you run, like introduce or deceive the players early, win their trust as the boss, and then deceive them later?
Once. I decided to do a psychological villain, like somebody whose main power is just manipulating people. I really wanted that to be like a core theme of their identity. And in that vein, I wanted one of their main powers to be like illusion magic. I really wanted them to be able to manipulate reality, so to speak, to make people think that it is the way that they set it up. And as part of this, the players first met them as a concerned citizen of the town and got to know them, and even got to meet people that trusted them, and really got involved with the community. Only, after a lot of time spent to realize that no, like that person who was, lip service to them helping and fixing the problem actually was using this whole town to do their bidding. So that was a really fun setup for me to pull that off over multiple sessions. It was nerve-wracking because as a DM, you're like, surely they'll just see through this like straight away. There's no way that I can even see it's too flimsy as a plot. And then it's like, in the end, they're like, wow, like it was just like, it was so cool to see how much they enjoyed something that to me, I didn't think was like a good enough writing, but like the players were just so immersed in the moment to moment gameplay that they had more fun with it than I expected them to.
How often do you think players actually look at that bigger picture versus just being, okay, what's happening in this session?
Yeah, I personally think that's like one of those things people always tell you. It's like people spend way less time thinking about you than you think they do. I think the same is true about our D&D worlds. It's like we're here living in it, like next step, like the boss's motivation, like yeah, but they asked the question about that, which means it's like they're just like, wee, they have no idea what's happening.
100%. There's so much stress to make sure everything's connected, and just like, wee, you're right.
I think sometimes it was ironic, is like we can spend half of a campaign kind of like feeling things out a little bit, and the second we kind of click and figure out what the ending is going to be, we can like be very specific around those like little hints. We can be like, wow, somebody walked into the tavern with a lanyard saying like, speak to me if you want to know more about the mines in the town next door. And you're like, you can be a little bit more signposty like that. Obviously not that exactly that bad, but I think that's the power of like them not actually being able to connect the dots like we can, knowing the ending, is that when we're ready to give them information to move the plot along, they're usually like very receptive to it and like, oh, I didn't realize that, like they're having aha moments that you thought that you'd already given them enough context to figure out, but they obviously hadn't because they're not connecting everything together like we can.
Well, absolutely. It's something which I am trying to do, but I don't want to overdo it, like laying breadcrumbs around different clues to sort of build up to other bigger plot lines. But I don't want them to be, you put a lot of time and effort into it, and for them to be not picked up straight away, I sometimes think, shit, am I going to remember how this all works in 6 months, 12 months time? Or is it just going to be like confusing for everyone?
To that point, I think this is a cool question around character design and bosses. You've got these big bosses that you've obviously built your campaign around. Bosses that are going to be reoccurring, bosses that will end up becoming a big deal in the world that you've created. You've also got characters who sometimes have, created their entire backstory without your end boss in mind. How do you go about connecting, the starting point of the characters to these big bosses that are coming down the road? How do you make sure that they're going to be invested in defeating the big bad from their personal backstories?
That is a huge question. I don't know if I've got a complete answer for that right now, because it's something which I am continually iterating on. I've got a nice document that I'm constantly kind of throwing ideas on how characters' backstories can tie into the broader plot points of the campaign. They may not always, at least yet, tie into the big boss at the end, but they'll absolutely tie into the smaller bosses, sort of spread throughout. And for some of the at the moment, not every one of my players or characters has a direct connection in their backstory to an end boss. However, some do, and my hope is that by the time that this becomes apparent, they'll be like a tight-knit enough party, but they'll want to help each other out.
Nice.
If that party cohesion doesn't exist, they might get to the point where like, well, my problem's solved. See ya. But I should hope not.
I laugh a bit at the parallels between D&D and the corporate world, but like, as with any good co-worker relationship, a little bit of trauma bonding goes a long way. And if D&D is not just a collective sort of trauma bonding from your character's perspective, I don't know what is.
Trauma bonding brings us all together, absolutely. I mean, how have you approached that kind of thing? Do you look to try and tie backstories into the big threat from the outset?
Yeah, I think ideally I would have more of that. It's one of those things that like being ad hoc means that I don't spend a lot of time really meticulously tying threads together, strategically. I often find myself like at a pivot point in the story and then looking for, a few sessions ahead, like what threads from a character's backstory do I have, like open threads that I can start to work with. And I think that's one of the key values of creating open-ended backstories is that you do give your DM a lot of opportunities to tie you into the world, in ways that you don't necessarily have to be very informed on, but they can like tie it into you and make you grounded in the story they're writing. So I definitely look for that. And I think in my games that I've streamed and games before that, it was easy to see the players that were the most invested in connecting their character to my world and my story and where I was taking the campaign. It was easy to bring them back in as reoccurring sort of connection points. I found the characters who've, had stories connecting them away from the main narrative difficult. To your point earlier, like if a combat is just, you and 16 rounds, 40 seconds of combat over 4 hours, I think the same is to be said. Like, we can spend another 3 months adventuring away from the story, but we're all very busy and we all want to, have a concluding finish to this campaign. Like, although that sounds cool, I think we can spend an entire, campaign in that story that is going to be the detour to go, save your family from the foreign force or whatever it might be. And I think that's where it can be a bit of a challenge, is that sometimes I feel like certain players might come into the campaign wanting their character and like the story to follow a path. But it's, I think, important to be able to help them bring their character back into the fold when they may have written a bit skew, whether from their own writing or your lack of really knowing where the game was going to be going. But those little check-ins and readjustments need to happen over time to really keep it rolling.
It's funny you mention all that, because I know when we jumped into Waterdeep, that was my first foray into D&D, and I think I gave you like an overly elaborate backstory with like zero wiggle room. Because in my brain at the time was like, oh, this is the connection, this is the opportunity to solve my backstory problem. But I had no idea at the time what the setting was going to be, having never been in that position before. So I can fully appreciate that I didn't give you much to work with there.
I also think like the best players, and I'm still working on like developing my DMing style to bring this out in people. But like the more somebody is invested in like steering their destiny as their character and like the direction of their character, the easier it is to like help them achieve the milestones they need to reach what they want to do. The world might not be kind, they might die, they might be wiped out before they can achieve those goals, but keeping me informed of where you see your character going is also one of those other things. Like, it's front of mind for me. I know how the world has impacted your character's thinking. And so now I'm like, I can keep that stitched in as I go and keep modifying it and twisting the direction to match.
Is that something you would proactively ask for players for, or is that something you kind of expect players to reach out to you with?
I think the reality is that it works best when somebody is proactive with their character and really is owning their character's direction and future. It's like I am worried about, like you said before, too many other things. Like I'm trying to figure out how many phases to put in a boss fight, how to make sure there's enough minions to make sure it's challenging. What do I do if they don't never leave the tavern? I'm trying to figure out all of this, right? I believe like if you want your character to be a certain way, the least you could do is like help me like understand what that like where you see your character going.
100%.
It's like we can always negotiate, and I think there's a few times where I've been like, yes, and like let's take that idea and I can fit it in over here in a kind of a different way, but you're going to be integral to my world. Is that a good compromise? And oftentimes it'll be like, yes, please. I would love to be that. Like I want to be more involved. And it's like it makes it epic. It's like suddenly together, like I have a story problem. I'm like, something needs to fit here. Something is like the cornerstone of the why behind this part of the campaign. And sometimes like I'll figure out like what happens and what leads up to it, but I don't know what that critical moment is. That's where it's like a player can be like, I've been thinking that I want my character to like go through a bit of a transformation. I'm not really happy with where it's at right now. I'd really love to try being, a cleric or a necromancer or like become a paladin. Great. Now I've got my moment, and I can tie everything leading up to it and afterwards to this like character progression, but like without knowing that you are willing to undergo kind of that very, I'd say, invasive procedure. Like I don't have the story to really work with until I get that from you.
It's funny, yeah. I can appreciate that players bringing in either very in-depth backstories or zero backstory or not being forthcoming with opportunity can be challenging. It's interesting in the Realm of the Frostbend thing we're going through at the moment. One of the things that it focuses on or it has as an opportunity to work with is these things called character secrets, which are essentially backstory seeds, which are awesome because then throughout the entire thing, it's like if someone has this character secret, this kind of thing plays out, or this could be interesting to them.
Nice.
So it kind of threads that throughout. It's not saying that this is the exclusive backstory you have to work with, but it's like here's a secret they carry, and they can. It's up to them whether they reveal it, whenever they reveal it.
And everybody can bring their own secret, even if it's not like out of the book, I imagine.
Well, yeah. I mean, the way we did it, I had everyone roll for it, but I made sure everyone's got something different.
Nice. Good. You're good. That's really fun. I look forward to see how that all plays out.
It's good. It's good. We've seen a couple of things show up so far, but they haven't raised too many questions or suspicions. But yeah, I'm looking forward to how they will play out in the coming months, years.
I think like the other thing I really enjoyed in some games I ran, helping guide players on direction, stuff like that. I know it's not a boss related question. It kind of is, but when we talk about like factions, and we'll probably have an entire section on factions, but like the one of the best campaigns I ran, each player had almost like a deity who they were a patron of. I might have mentioned it a few times already, but having their deity as a way to always progress their story, even like as they were progressing the meta storyline, like they were able to check in with their deity every once in a while. Like one of them would get a visit from Hermes, who would come down with like a pair of winged shoes as a gift for, a particularly well done quest that Hermes gave them. It was cool to have that like one-on-one relationship kind of be their personal progress, while having the meta story of them saving the world as their party goal. So each of them had sort of their individual motivation, but also their party was aligned in that all the gods needed every single one of them to help, otherwise the world was doomed. Like the stakes were high enough for everybody to be like, we're saving our planet. and the rest of it kind of was fun to sprinkle in, like, here's a reward for you specifically because like your deity is very impressed with like how you acted here, or the way you interacted with this person, or that you chose violence here instead of peace. They're very involved in your choices and in your character's progression.
So in that, like, every player had their own carrot, so to speak, to lead, like, to give them motivation to move on.
And I think, like, something that I'd love to do more of, even in worlds where, like, the gods aren't that directly involved, is use those factions to say, I'm a part of this organization. We have a certain code and a certain creed. And sometimes I will be pulled in a direction that is hard for me because my people need me to, potentially act nefariously, or they need me to steal something without the rest of the party knowing. I think it adds like a level of like a dynamic nature to the party's relationships when they've got this, like, they're not just connected to the party, they also have other relationships that are affecting them.
Mm-hmm.
So more of that to come, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. That's something I'm trying to that is top of mind for me as well at the moment, is to have the players have more invested relationships in other parts of the world, not just themselves or their own little group. All right, they got to care.
I think that's a good topic. Like, how do we get players involved in the world? I think we should have that as a separate session for these DM chats.
We shall make a note.
As long as we have one ahead of where we're at right now, we'll always be in good hands.
Absolutely. One more question for you, Robin. What's the most creative way that any kind of your big bads have been dealt with by your players that you really didn't see coming?
I think, like, players always, when like the most interesting deaths or like beating of the boss, is when they can turn my world against me. I think that's when it becomes really fun for me as the DM. Like, I can sometimes think to myself, okay, part of this boss's mechanic and this phase, like, when I walk in this room, what's iconic about the scene that we've set? Maybe it's like a big cannon, or maybe it's like this boss has a particular proclivity to like really expensive whiskey. I've set this up for flavor and like connected it to more of like the lore behind who this individual is. And then my players are like, you're telling me he's surrounded by barrels of explosive and flammable like alcohol. And in my head, I'm like, oh no, I totally forgot. And like in my head, it's like, well, so did this guy, right? Like, he's arrogant. He doesn't care. And then my player cast fireball in the room, blowing both themselves up and the bad guys.
Oh, jeez, sacrifice.
So it was like, yeah, that's a creative solution. I don't know if it necessarily was the best strategic option, but like, here we are, roll a new character, I guess.
Completely wiped themselves out. Just sacrifice.
I mean, they just blew up all of this explosive, and they're in the room with this bad guy. Like, if the bad guy dies, they die. So
that's pretty creative.
That's one of those ones that's super, super creative. But like, every time magic's involved, or like we're jumping around, or potentially like manipulating them to go against their own best interests, I think often those are the most satisfying for me as the DM, when players can convince my bad guy on a logical level that this combat isn't worth engaging in. It's like coming to the table as an adversary, like trying to first reason with them. Maybe it'll fail, but sometimes, every once in a while, it has to work, because like, if you're able to convince them, to your point earlier, that from the player's point of view, whatever this bad guy chooses to do tonight, either they come on board or they get killed. It's like, they can believe you or not, but at the end of the day, some sense of self-preservation has to still exist for them to feel believable.
Yeah, I mean, what would be the charisma roll for something like that to convince the bad guy that he's on the wrong track?
But it gotta be there, right?
The option's gotta be there, I guess, but it'd have to be pretty
I think
impressive.
one of the ways I did this the other day, and I thought was interesting as I was brainstorming, was like, you might need to convince someone of something, and earlier on, as part of a different phase of the adventure, you would have been given an opportunity to like maybe collect some of their personal possessions or find things that they personally like care about, and whether or not you engaged in that gives you a better or worse outcome at like that negotiation. It's like if you can prove that you know them, that you've got that like inside track, that you're not just like coming and say, of course we'll beat you, because we're strong, right? You come with your receipts. I think all of that contributes in how I either increase or decrease the DC 30 check on something like that.
Yeah, absolutely huge. Excellent. One of those surprising ways I've had one of my villains get defeated, and this happened last week. I had him holding like a dead man switch, with a room full of 5 pretty decent creatures that were going to wipe the party out more or less. And the theory was that if he got killed, dead man switch gets dropped, all the creatures come out and destroy the party. My thinking was that they would find some creative way, find the secret second switch in the room to balance things out and not let all the creatures out. Instead, what they did was they grabbed hold of this guy's hand around the dead man switch so that he couldn't let go of it. He wasn't a powerful guy, he was more of a political player than anything else. They dragged him out to a chair between all these cells, strapped him to it, cut his arm so he would start to bleed out, and then said, "See you later," and left him there. I was like, oh shit, that's brutal. I love it, but that is brutal. It was amazing.
Now, your job as a DM, if they didn't see them die, then the rules of stories are they're probably still alive.
Well,
so how did you get there?
They heard him stop screaming, right? However, they've just let out half a dozen high-level creatures in this nice little village.
That's less than ideal for the village, I imagine.
It is less than ideal for the village. So I don't think that one was thought through, but they just left straight away. They bolted, so there'll absolutely be repercussions for those actions.
I do want to ask something though. The last thing that I thought of was like, I don't know if you ever played the Lord of the Rings Shadow of Mordor games.
I have.
So the nemesis system in those games, where you have a monster that you fight, like depending on the outcome, like let's say they survive, they go off, they come back stronger, right? Like they've developed in the meantime to come take you on. So I guess like my question is, have you ever thought of doing something like that where you've got like a villain that grows alongside your players as they grow stronger, so do your villain? Or is it something that you've ever considered bringing in?
Well, I am now. I hadn't thought about it before. Everything I thought about before was, this is the villain, this is how he works, and he's going to come out at this point. I'd never even really considered like leveling them up should they get an opportunity to go and level up. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I guess, I mean, I can see that working really well and fairly easily in a very homebrew scenario. I've just got to find a way to try and massage that mechanic into a module campaign.
I think the other way to do that is like just kind of in a smaller scale, but if their monsters know you're coming, they're going to react very differently to whether or like they didn't know you were coming. And kind of like bringing in a little bit of that, like if it's an alarmed state, everybody's on high alert, and like the players are going to have a tough time, like kind of bringing in that natural progression of difficulty if they are either smooth or not smooth in how they approach things.
Yeah, absolutely. If the villains or the bad guys are waiting prepared for you, they're on a next level type setting.
Did you like also when you were starting, and like I'm definitely still guilty of this, but like you think of your dungeons very much in the way they set them up in the books. It's like this room is kind of isolated. What happens in this room is you face 4 goblins, and then you move into the next room, and then you clear that room, and you move to the third room, and then you clear that. It's like the dungeon is less alive, and it's more like a procedurally generated sort of crawl. And I think like the upgrade to my game engine is like there's a bell at the start. If somebody gets to the bell and rings through, all 3 rooms will come forward, right? It's like it's way more deadly, not in the individual rooms, but if you don't play it carefully and you let them get any advantage, you can be quickly overrun.
Absolutely. The world's a living world, right? It's got to react accordingly. And there should absolutely be people ringing alarms. And what would normally happen? There's not going to be 4 goblins just standing in a room waiting to be attacked, right? That's just not how it's going to work. Not in this version of the game, anyway.
No, not yet. Not in this current day and age.
As the first time I encountered or came across that kind of mechanic was in one of the Candlekeep Mysteries adventures. So it was like, if the players do this, then one of the guys here is going to run down and tell the big boss what's going on, so they're all going to be ready for him. If they kill him before it happens, then it's going to be a surprise later. So nice. I was like, oh yeah, okay, of course, the whole thing is alive.
On this note, you're going to love Baldur's Gate 3.
Alarms getting set up everywhere.
And a very alive world.
Well, I'm looking forward to playing it.
I think I'd love to do an episode on this as well, on even just like the first act of that game, because I think we can learn a lot about what makes D&D fun as a game with the way that they've simplified the combat and streamlined some of those narrative elements. Like it's almost like a great showcase of how to run D&D as the DM, because the game engine is sort of playing your role and you get to experience the player side of it. So I'd love to chat through it with you once you've had a chance to dig into it, to see what you've learned to take in with you to your games.
Hopefully over the summer holidays, I'll have a chance to get my hands into it. I haven't.
You've heard that here. 2024 will be the year we hear about Jez's Baldur's Gate 3 adventures.
Let's go. But for now, Robin, we might wrap it up there. We have a couple of good ideas to take into future sessions, future Dungeon Masteries. This could very well be the last one of these for 2023.
Good chance.
So, I hope you're going to come back for another round in 2024.
Oh, I wouldn't miss them. Until we run out of things to talk about, I will happily keep joining, and I don't see that happening anytime soon.
We've already got a couple of extra topics around factions. One other one I'm sure you wrote down somewhere, and before that we've got about another 30 or 40 ideas to talk about, because I want to learn.
And I want to also learn.
So with that, thanks folks for sticking around and hanging out with us. Don't forget you can check out Rime of the Frostband campaigns we run normally on Thursday nights on our YouTubes, on wherever you find good podcasts. You can find these sessions and others on the same type of channels. So do check it out. Let us know what you think. Come and find us in the Discord as well. I'll put that link in the chat now. And we'll be seeing you soon. I don't think we won't have a session next week. No session next week. We have other commitments. We might be back in December for 1 or 2 before we break for the year. So stay tuned. We have some more chaos planned before we wrap up the year. Thanks so much, guys. Cheers, Robin. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
See you guys.